For years, the narrative was simple. Wall Street doesn't want XRP. Then, April 2026 happened. Goldman Sachs, one of the most conservative banks on the planet, is now the biggest institutional holder in the U.S. spot XRP ETFs. $153 million. So what does it really mean? Is Goldman betting on XRP? Or is something else going on? Let's dive in. On April 27, 2026, crypto.news published the breakdown of institutional holders across the U.S. spot XRP ETFs, and one name sat at the top of the list: Goldman Sachs. Position size: $153.8 million. Not a rumor, not a leak, not a tweet from an anonymous analyst. A regulatory filing in black and white. Now take a step back. This is the same Goldman Sachs that, for years, treated XRP like it didn't exist. The same Goldman whose analysts publicly warned about altcoin risk. The same Goldman whose CEO, David Solomon, stood on stage and said he wasn't interested in crypto, unless it was heavily regulated. And now, they're the biggest institutional name in the XRP ETF space. That's a shift worth examining carefully, because a bank like Goldman doesn't stumble into a $150 million position. They don't wake up one morning and decide to experiment. Every dollar in that position went through compliance, legal, risk, and portfolio management. Multiple committees, multiple signatures, multiple months of preparation. So when you see that number, don't read it as excitement. Read it as approval. But before you jump to any conclusions, there's a crucial distinction most people miss. Goldman didn't buy XRP. They bought shares of a fund that holds XRP. And that difference changes everything. Zoom out for a second. Goldman's position isn't happening in isolation. It's part of something much larger. The U.S. spot XRP ETFs have now pulled in $1.29 billion in cumulative net inflows. That's billion with a B. In April alone, $81.63 million came in, the strongest monthly number of the year so far. And here's the part that really stands out. Since April 9th, there has not been a single day of net outflows. Not one. For an altcoin ETF, that's a record. Even Bitcoin ETFs, the gold standard of crypto ETFs, have had multiple outflow days during their first months. XRP ETFs have had zero. Total net assets across XRP ETF products: $1.53 billion. The week of April 17th alone, $55 million came in, and roughly 35 million XRP left exchanges during the same period. That last number matters, because when XRP leaves an exchange and moves into ETF custody, it doesn't come back easily. It sits, it stays. And the circulating supply that retail has access to gets a little bit thinner. Multiply this over months, over quarters, over years, and you start to see why the structure of the XRP market in 2026 is fundamentally different from the structure it had in 2023. So why now? Why would Goldman, the bank that waited years to even touch Bitcoin, suddenly take a 9-figure position in XRP ETF? The answer is regulatory. In March 2026, the SEC and the CFTC published a joint guidance. For the first time in history, these two agencies agreed on a framework for classifying crypto assets, and XRP was officially placed in the commodity category. That one decision unlocked something massive, because when an asset is classified as a commodity, the rules change for institutions. Their legal teams can sign off. Their compliance departments can approve exposure. Their risk committees stop saying no. It's not that XRP suddenly became a better asset. It's that the path to holding it became legally safe. For a bank like Goldman, legal safety is everything. They don't care about potential upside the way retail investors do. They care about not getting sued by their shareholders, not getting fined by their regulators, not getting headlines they didn't plan for. Once XRP crossed that regulatory line, the door was open. Goldman didn't wake up one morning and decide to love XRP. They waited for the one thing they needed: legal clarity. And once they had it, they moved fast. In about 30 days, they built a position that almost no institutional investor thought was possible a year ago. Now, here's where most people get it wrong. When you read, Goldman holds $153 million in XRP, your brain fills in the rest. You picture Goldman buying XRP, storing XRP, owning XRP the way you own XRP. That's not what's happening. Goldman holds shares of an ETF. The ETF issuer, BlackRock, Bitwise, Franklin, whoever, holds the actual XRP in institutional custody. So, technically, Goldman owns a claim on a fund that owns XRP. Why does this matter? Because in a crisis, those claims behave differently. Let me break it down. If you hold XRP in self-custody, you control the keys. Nobody can freeze your position. Nobody can delist you. You and the ledger. That's it. If you hold XRP on an exchange, you hold a claim on that exchange. And exchanges can fail. Remember FTX. Remember Celsius. Remember Mt. Gox. If Goldman holds XRP via ETF, they hold a claim on the fund, which holds a claim on the custodian. 3 different structures, 3 different risk profiles, 3 different levels of control. The ETF route is regulated, audited, insured. But it's also one more layer between the holder and the actual asset on the XRP ledger. Same underlying asset, but very different ownership. And that's not a small detail. That's the whole story of why institutional adoption looks the way it does. You might be wondering, if Goldman wanted XRP exposure, why not just buy XRP directly? They have the money, they have the tech, they probably have an entire team that could figure out cold storage in an afternoon. The answer is boring, but it's the real answer. It's not about trust in XRP. It's about the rules big institutions have to follow. Accounting rules, fiduciary rules, custody rules. Under FASB ASU 2023-08, effective January 2025, U.S. firms can now mark crypto at fair value on their balance sheet. That was a huge step. Before that rule, holding crypto directly meant writing it down whenever the price dropped, but never writing it up when it rose. It made crypto painful on the books. But even with that fixed, direct custody still requires specialized infrastructure, hardware security modules, insurance policies that most carriers don't even offer, licensed trust company charters, full audit trails, ERISA compliance for anything touching retirement capital. An ETF solves all of that in one wrapper. The custodian handles the keys. The issuer handles compliance. The fund handles reporting. Goldman handles one line in a spreadsheet. For a bank that manages trillions, simplicity isn't laziness, it's risk management. And it's the reason why, even as more and more institutions get interested in crypto, most of them will enter through ETFs, long before they ever touch direct custody. Okay, so what does all of this actually mean for you? Let's be honest, this doesn't mean XRP is going up. This doesn't mean Goldman is bullish forever. This doesn't mean Wall Street is finally waking up. Here's what it actually means. The XRP market is now structurally mature enough to absorb institutional capital in a regulated way. That's the real signal. 5 years ago, no bank in Goldman's category could have taken this position. The legal risk was too high. The accounting was messy. The custody was unclear. The SEC was still suing Ripple. Today, $153 million sits on a Goldman filing, and nobody at the SEC is blinking. That's the quiet revolution. Not the price, not the hype. The fact that XRP has become a normal asset in an institutional portfolio. That's a change that took years. That took a lawsuit, a court decision, a new Congress, a new SEC chair, a joint guidance, an accounting rule change, and a dozen ETF approvals. All of that had to happen before a Goldman compliance officer could finally sign off. And once that happens once, it happens again. Other banks see the filing. Other risk committees notice the lack of fallout. Other firms start asking their legal teams the same questions. That's how institutional capital moves. Slowly, quietly, and then suddenly. So, if you hold XRP in self-custody right now, what does all of this change for you? On a practical level, not that much. You still own the same XRP you owned a month ago. Your keys are still yours. Your risk profile hasn't changed. But on a structural level, something did shift. The float of XRP that's freely tradable is slightly smaller, because 35 million XRP just moved from exchanges into institutional custody. Institutional demand now has a regulated way to enter this market, through ETFs. And the perception of XRP inside the traditional finance world just moved one big step closer to normal. None of this guarantees anything about price, but it does change who you share the asset with. You're no longer holding XRP alongside only retail investors and early adopters. You're holding it alongside Goldman Sachs. That's not a prediction, that's just a fact. And knowing the fact is better than guessing the narrative. It also means something else. It means the rules of this asset are starting to be written in filings, prospectuses, and audit reports, not just in Reddit threads and YouTube videos. The information gap between retail and institutions is narrowing, but only for the people who actually pay attention. Here's the part most people miss. The real story of April 2026 isn't that Goldman bought XRP ETFs. The real story is how quietly it happened. No press release, no CEO keynote, no headline from Jamie Dimon. Just a number on a regulatory filing. $153.8 million. That's how institutional adoption actually works. It doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives through filings, through slow structural change, through regulatory frameworks being approved in rooms most people never hear about. If you've been waiting for a clear signal that XRP is entering the institutional world, this is what it looks like. Not loud, not obvious, just documented. And here's the takeaway. Don't read Goldman's position as a buy signal. Don't read it as proof of anything about price. Read it as what it actually is, a data point. A data point that tells you the structure of this market has changed. The holders have diversified. The regulatory runway is open. The infrastructure is in place. What you do with that information is up to you. But for anyone who actually reads the documents, the story is already clear. And now, you've read it too.